tentative budget, all the fun stuff.
Kristen's got a lot of questions. She can cover some of that. Definitely some good news, right, Kristen?
Correct. The budget begins on page 45 of board book. And since the board received the tentative budget in July, the June 30th actuals were used to make changes through line items throughout the budget. The projected deficit has decreased to $427,714 without the proposed working cash transfer that we'll talk about later in the board meeting. The significant changes that were made to reduce the deficit include increasing revenues such as corporate personal property replacement tax based off of the estimate that was recently released, as well as evidence-based funding to include the new tiered funding for the first time, as well as cell tower revenue based upon contracts, and then a little bit of additional local revenue based off of FY19 actuals. I want to stress that the CPPRT and the evidence-based funding were just released. Otherwise, it would have been added much sooner. The evidence-based funding, for example, wasn't released until August 5th. So that's why we're seeing that additional revenue. Some expenditures also decreased in various departments based off of FY19 actuals, and then internet costs decreased due to the state funding broadband, which saves us some money as well. So there were several questions that were submitted on the budget. They begin on page 46 of board book. Title I revenue is budgeted significantly higher than FY19 actuals. This is because it's based off of anticipated expenditures in this fiscal year. So Title I is tricky because the grant spans 2 fiscal years. And so what happened last year is we had many expenditures that we thought were going to hit in the last quarter of fiscal year 19, and they actually are going to hit in fiscal year 20, and then that means the revenue also comes in fiscal year 20 as well. So I do feel pretty confident about that number. Food Service Commission, Quest, revenue is for RB and satellite schools. This was significantly down last year. It's the lowest it's been in 3 years. Student enrollment in each school has stayed about the same. To get the number for the budget, I used a 3-year historical, which was around 91,000, and then I lowered it a little bit since there was such a significant jump from the last 2 years to this year. I also met with the account manager, and she felt that the number I put in the budget was a number that we would be able to hit. So that's where I came up with that number. Service providers to other schools / food service is a pass-through account for Quest. So what happens is Quest bills us for our satellite schools, and we pay them on the expenditure side, and then we recover the money on the revenue side from the satellite schools. This again was significantly lower than the last 2 previous years. So as an anomaly, sales did certainly have some impact on this. And again, I used a 3-year average, which came out to 367, and then I lowered it a little bit to 360 since there was such a big gap. And this kind of mirrors the expenditure side, which you'll see in a little bit.
So quick follow-up on that one. What is Quest attributing the decrease to?
They were not 100% certain. They did have some new leadership this year, and so they do think that that may have been a part of it, but they put together a sales plan to bring the sales back up. Last we left it is they were going to try to dig to see if there was any other reasons they could find, and they weren't able to find any at this point. Because we did look at enrollment, and we did look at other things that we could think of as to why sales dropped. And the one thing that we did notice was there was a transition in both the program here as well as the satellite schools. So that could have possibly had an impact on it.
I just wonder if they would ask their customers. I mean, are the students not finding there to be enough variety or healthy choices, or is something else triggering a decrease? I don't know.
Yes, I
curious.
asked all of those questions as well. Special ed orphanage is money that we get for any special education student that is awarded the state. We got a lot of revenue last year because the state was significantly behind on their payments. And so the payments, $70,000 was for 2 years. We do get reimbursed at 100% for this expense, but we don't know if the state's going to make all of their payments. We don't have any information on that. So if we did get all the payments, it would be roughly $50,000. So what I did is I budgeted for 3 payments, which is 36. It was 37, and then I looked at half of 70 was 35, so I came up with 36. special ed room and board is being budgeted at 29 less than the 2019 actual. And this is because we have to go off of what the fiscal year 19 actuals were and then do a certain percentage. So this could vary from year to year depending on if we have less students that are outplaced or the placement changes and they go from, residential to just a therapeutic day program. So the number that I put in the budget was based off of what our actuals were, and then a percentage of that, which is what I think we'll get from the state. Lastly, on the revenue side, there was a question on the Medicaid matching funds. And this is really split into two accounts. So there's one that's the fee-for-service and the admin outreach. The fee-for-service is what we'll be using the new software program for. We do anticipate some additional revenue for that. I can't predict exactly what it is, and so I took a conservative approach of doubling what was in the budget as opposed to going off of actuals for the first year, and then figured we could reevaluate after that. There were more questions, but are there any other additional questions on the revenue assumptions? Okay, so on page 47 of board book, the substitute budget reflects a 3-year historical, decreased a little bit. So the 3-year historical was $235,000, but I decreased it a little bit because last year we had a significant increase in FMLA leaves by $20,000 than what we normally have. And I don't anticipate that many FMLA leaves. So that's why I lowered it to $225,000.
Kristen, what would be the negative if we left it at 254 to see if there was any benefit from the new contract language? Obviously, if we left it at 254 and you currently have it at 225, that'd be roughly an additional $30,000 in deficit, right?
Correct. The 3 years, again, FMLA plays a significant role in this. So fiscal year 19 was clearly the 254, fiscal year 18 was 191, and then fiscal year 17 was 262 because we also had a high number of FMLA leaves. So I can certainly put any number.
Why don't we
on
circle
the
this
board
one, talk
wants.
about it a little more at finance?
Okay.
Just to see if it's worth going year to year or.
Yeah, because something I would like to track, because the FMLA is different than just calling it sick, right?
Well, I mean, if based on the three numbers you just shared, FY18 was 191, but the other 2 years were both over 250.
Correct, but without FMLA, fiscal year 17 also had a significant number of maternity leaves in addition to other FMLA leaves. And that's kind of the unpredictable part. The rest of it is somewhat predictable. It's really the FMLA piece that has an impact on the budget.
And just to clarify, I think we should have a discussion about this as the budget kind of evolves. You do intermittent or continuous FMLA? What's the concern? These are in additional continuous FMLA claims?
They include any FMLA.
Any
claims,
FMLA,
whether-
okay.
Yes,
But it still comes out of the sub-budget.
correct.
Right,
So
but it's also,
technically
it's gonna be
it's-
workers' comp, it's gonna be FMLA, it's gonna be sick days, it's gonna be
Correct.
anything.
And the important thing to consider is on the years where there is a significant increase for maternity leave, there may be cost savings because that teacher has a higher salary and then we're bringing in a longer term sub at a lower rate. That's not going to be reflected in this one particular line item, no.
Right.
So even
I
though
will flag it.
sub-budget could be up, if the person's taking a leave, we could be saving money
If a
on the
person-
salary side.
Correct. For example, if a person takes a semester leave for maternity leave, we are paying their sub out of the sub account, but we are not paying all of their salary out of their salary line item. So it's a little more complicated than just looking at that one line item, but I will flag it for the Finance
Thank you.
Advisory Council. And then the last question on the expenditure on page 47 was the food service expenditures again, and I used a 3-year average, and then I tried to make sure the revenues and expenditures were budgeted very similar in terms of how the year finishes with the discrepancy between the two. And so that's why I budgeted that one at I believe 350. There was some additional questions submitted on page 49 of board book. And these are about cost increases over the last 10 years. So what this chart shows is that property tax revenues have increased 19% over 10 years, so on average 1.9%. Employee salary and benefits have increased 22% over 10 years, so again, on average 2.2% a year. And transportation has increased significantly, 73% over 10 years. So yes, that's much more significant. I would say that's many schools, not all schools, are experiencing that. So not only have transportation costs in general increased, but our transportation costs are primarily for special education students in addition to field trips and athletics. And so when a student is outplaced, there's also a transportation cost associated with that. So certainly over the last 10 years, we've had more special education students outplaced. So as a result, transportation also is
I
a
thought I was
line
reading
item.
that right.
Yes.
Am I reading this right?
And then finally, related to the budget, there was a question submitted on pay to play. There were 25 students that played 3 sports in fiscal year 18. I don't have the data compiled yet on fiscal year 19. But if we were to waive that fee, obviously it would reduce the revenue by $2,500. I don't know how many additional students would want to play a 3rd sport because that fee wasn't there. But there were 25 students in fiscal year 18. And that is it for the budget.
Chris, now one last thing, that I just want to make sure it was clear. I know there was a comment submitted. Was it accurate that special ed costs in regards to tuition in our LADC costs in the last 5 years has increased by close to 87%?
Correct.
Okay.
And the textbooks.
I think the textbooks are included with the other things
Other
like
department
technology,
budgets.
department,
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot more included
It's
in there
gone
other
up.
than textbooks.
Dramatically as well, too.
Kristen, is there a way to maybe
120.
sometime in the future put down the enrollment each year so we can see the number of kids and then possibly even see the growth of special needs? Or-
Are you, certainly, are you asking for special education or or special education and the total enrollment?
I would do both just to be.
both.
Yeah.
And if you do that, include a probably percentage, because it may not be that, the increase might be proportional, that's all I'm saying.
Right. Well, I think the thing is that I was looking at here was that the property tax has gone up 20%, and the salaries have gone up 22%. They're very proportional, and the other cost of running the school has gone up dramatically more.
Yeah.
And the revenue, as the majority of our revenues from property tax, has not matched the increase of the auxiliary charges, right? The cost of running a school. It's more expensive, it's 10 years.
So I think,
It costs more money.
yeah, no, I don't disagree. I think as we meet next week and get into the final budget, I think it might be helpful to illustrate this, and I think you might have done this in previous years a little bit, illustrate this in some different ways, right? It's whether it's a line graph, but I also think we need to kind of categorize what's in these different operating funds. I think the operating funds don't necessarily track with the budget sections, and so doing a 1-for-1 is a little bit challenging. It's kind of one of my follow-up questions. So I think putting some, almost like a one-pager coming out of the budget that explains Wes's point about revenues and expenses, I think over a larger window. I mean, a 3-year snapshot is one thing, but I think 10 years is a more, or 5 years, whatever we think is more appropriate to tell the story, but also to show what those individual buckets entail, because it's easy to think about special ed in one way, but it's special ed plus transportation, right? It's easy to think about salaries for certified personnel and salaries for administration. Like, how do we sort of separate them all out to understand the different pieces, the different levers that are under their control? Does that make sense? I think we just need to kind of think through some ways to illustrate this.
There's a lot of different variables in there. Any other? Do we have more?
I think when we put that together, we'll get into more detail at the finance advisory council. We'll need to give Chris some additional time to pull that off.
Mhm.
Right.
Oh, no, I wasn't suggesting for
Okay.
next week, I was suggesting for once the budget is finalized.
Right.
I think as we put it on the website and,
Yeah.
the document itself is,
It's cumbersome.
cumbersome, right? It's
Well, and I think
complicated.
it's
School
just
funding is
like
a cheat
a
sheet.
white paper, a cheat sheet, something that really summarizes it.
I like the idea as we go into, October, November, December, when we're setting up, basically, we're setting up the budget for next year.
Mhm.
That's when we're using the documents going, let's talk about these things going into how we're gonna set up next year's 20 and 21 school year. Because this is the information we need to make decisions in November, December, and January.
Mhm.
Okay, Wes, we'll go on
Oh, that was it? There's no more
That was the
fun?
budget.
Kristen, you're done? Oh.
Have more,
I-
but for the bills.
to, trying to deflect, Krista.
I was like, there's no way we're